5 forward slash signs and the blink of an eye. The force of this demonstration presupposes the instant as a point, the identity of experience instantaneously present to itself. Self-presence must be produced in the undivided unity of a temporal present so as to have nothing to reveal to itself by the agency of signs. Such a perception or intuition of self by self in presence would not only be the case where signification in general could not occur, but also would assure the general possibility of a primordial perception or intuition, i.e., of non-scenification as the principle of principles. Later, whenever Husserl wants to stress the sense of primordial intuition, he will recall that it is the experience of the absence and uselessness of signs. 1. The demonstration we are now concerned with was elaborated before his lectures on the phenomenology of internal time consciousness. 2. For reasons that are as much historical as systematic, the temporality of experience is not a theme of the logical investigations. At this point, however, we cannot avoid noting that a certain concept of the now of the present as punctuality of the instant, discreetly but decisively sanctions the whole system of essential distinctions. If the punctuality of the instant is a myth, a spatial or mechanical metaphor, an inherited metaphysical concept, or all that at once, and if the present of self-presence is not simple, if it is constituted in a primordial and irreducible synthesis, then the whole of Husserl's argumentation is threatened in its very principle. We cannot here go closely into the admirable analysis of the phenomenology of internal time consciousness, which Heidegger, in Sein und Zeit, calls the first in the history of philosophy to break with the concept of time inherited from Aristotle's physics, determined according to the basic notions of the now, the point, the limit and the circle. Let us, however, assemble some references from the lectures that are relevant for our own point of view. Whether or not it is a metaphysical presupposition, the concept of punctuality, of the now as stigm, still plays a major role in the phenomenology of internal time consciousness. Undoubtedly, no now can be isolated as a pure instant, a pure punctuality. Not only does Husserl recognize this, it belongs to the essence of lived experiences that they must be extended in this fashion, that a punctual phase can never be for itself, etc. 19, et. p. 70, but his whole description is incomparably well adapted to the original modifications of this irreducible spreading out. This spread is nonetheless thought and described on the basis of the self-identity of the now as point, as a source point. In phenomenology, the idea of primordial presence and in general of beginning absolute beginning or principium asterisk always refers back to this source point. Although the flow of time is not severable into parts which could be by themselves nor divisible into phases, points of the continuity, which could be by themselves the modes of running off of an immanent temporal object have a beginning, that is to say, a source point. This is the mode of running off with which the immanent object begins to be. In its characterized as now, etc., io, et, pp 48-49, despite all the complexity of its structures, temporality has a non-displaceable center, an I or living core, the punctuality of the real now. The now apprehension is, as it were, the nucleus of a Comef's tale of retentions, Ibid, 11, et, p. 52, and a punctual phase is actually present as now at any given moment, while the others are connected as a retentional train, Ibid, 16, et, p. 61. The actual now is necessarily something punctual, ein punctuals, and remains so, a form that persists through continuous change of mat ideas I, 81, et, p. 237, modified. It is to this self-same identity of the actual now that Husserl refers in the Ia Selben Augenblick we began with. Moreover, within philosophy there is no possible objection concerning this privilege of the present now. It defines the very element of philosophical thought. It is evidence itself, conscious thought itself. It governs every possible concept of truth and sense. No sooner do we question this privilege than we begin to get at the core of consciousness itself from a region that lies elsewhere than philosophy, a procedure that would remove every possible security and ground from discourse. In the last analysis, what is at stake is indeed the privilege of the actual present, the now. This conflict, necessarily unlike any other, is between philosophy, Rick is always a philosophy of presence, and a meditation on non-presence, which is not perforce its contrary, or necessarily a meditation on a negative absence, or a theory of non-presence qua unconsciousness. The dominance of the now not only is integral to the system of the founding contrast established by metaphysics, that between form, or eidos or idea, and matter as a contrast between act and potency, the actual now is necessarily something punctual and remains so, a form that persists through continuous change of matted, ideas I, 81, et, p. 237. It also assures the tradition that carries over the Greek metaphysics of presence into the modern metaphysics of presence understood as self. Consciousness, the metaphysics of the idea as representation, Vorstellung. It therefore designates the locus of a problem in which phenomenology confronts every position centered on non-consciousness that can approach what is ultimately at stake, what is at bottom decisive, the concept of time. It is no accident that the phenomenology of internal time consciousness both confirms the dominance of the present and rejects the after event of the becoming conscious of an unconscious content which is the structure of temporality implied throughout Freud's texts. 4 Husserl writes to this effect, present. In this way not only is what could be called the metaphysical assurance par excellence shaken, but, closer to our concerns, the Im Selben Augenblick argument in the investigations is undermined. In its critical as well as descriptive work, the phenomenology of internal time consciousness demonstrates and confirms throughout the irreducibility of representation, Vergendratigung, representation, to presentative perception, Gegenwärtigen, Percentieren, secondary and reproductive memory to retention, imagination to the primordial impression, the reproduced now to the perceived or retained actual now, etc. Without being able, here, to follow the rigorous development of this text, and without its being necessary to question its demonstrative worth, we can still examine its foundation of evidence and the context of these distinctions, which relates the terms distinguished to one another and constitutes the very possibility of their comparison. One then sees quickly that the presence of the perceived present can appear as such only inasmuch as it is continuously compounded with a non-presence and non-perception, with primary memory and expectation, retention and pretension. These non-perceptions are neither added to, nor do they occasionally accompany, the actually perceived now, they are essentially and indispensably involved in its possibility. Husserl admittedly says that retention is still a perception. But this is the absolutely unique case. Husserl never recognized any other, of a perceiving in which the perceived is not a present but a past existing as a modification of the present. If we call perception the act in which all origination lies, which constitutes originarily, then primary remembrance is perception. For only in primary remembrance do we see what is past, only in it is the past constituted, i.e., not in a representative but in a presentative way, 1 Tc. 17, et. p. 64. Thus, in retention, the presentation that enables us to see gives a non-present, a past and unreal present. We might suspect, then, that if Husserl nonetheless calls it perception, this is because he holds to establishing a radical discontinuity between retention and reproduction, between perception and imagination, etc., and not between perception and retention. This is the nervous demonstrandi of his critique of Brentano. Husserl resolutely maintains that there is no mention here of a continuous accommodation of perception to its opposite, Ibid. And yet, did not the preceding section quite explicitly entertain this very possibility? If we now relate what has been said about perception to the differences of the givenness with which temporal objects make their appearance, then the antithesis of perception is primary remembrance, which appears here, and primary expectation, retention and pretension, whereby perception and non-perception continually pass over into one another. ITC 16, ET, p. 62. Further he writes, in an ideal sense, then, perception, impression, would be the phase of consciousness which constitutes the pure now, and memory every other phase of the continuity. But this is just an ideal limit, something abstract which can be nothing for itself. Moreover, it is also true that even this ideal now is not something toto-silo different from the not now but continually accommodates itself thereto. The continual transition from perception to primary remembrance conforms to this accommodation. ITC 16, ET, p. 63. As soon as we admit this continuity of the now and the not now, perception and non-perception, in the zone of primordiality common to primordial impression and primordial retention, we admit the other into the self-identity of the Augenblick. Non-presence and non-evidence are admitted into the blink of the instant there is a duration to the blink, and it closes the eye. This alterity is in fact the condition for presence, presentation, and thus for Vorstellung in general. It precedes all the dissociations that could be produced in presence, in Vorstellung. The difference between retention and reproduction, between primary and secondary memory, is not the radical difference Husserl wanted between perception and non-perception, it is rather a difference between two modifications of non-perception. Whatever the phenomenological difference between these two modifications may be, and despite the immense problems it poses and the necessity of taking them into account, it only serves to separate two ways of relating to the irreducible non-presence of another now. Once again, this relation to non-presence neither befalls, surrounds, nor conceals the presence of the primordial impression, rather it makes possible its ever-renewed upsurge and virginity. However, it radically destroys any possibility of a simple self-identity. And this holds in depth for the constituting flux itself. If we now consider the constitutive phenomena, we find a flux, and every phase of this flux is a continuity of shading. However, in principle, no phase of this flux is to be broadened out to a continuous succession. Therefore, the flux should not be thought to be so transformed that this phase is extended in identity with itself. ITC 35, ET, p. 99, italics added. The fact that non-presence and otherness are internal to presence strikes at the very root of the argument for the uselessness of signs in the self-relation. 3. Doubtless Husserl would refuse to assimilate the necessity of retention and the necessity of signs, for it is only the latter which, like the image, belong to the genus of representation and symbolism. Moreover, Husserl cannot give up this rigorous distinction without bringing into question the axiomatic principium of phenomenology itself. The force with which he maintains that retention and pretension belong to the sphere of the primordial, provided it be understood in the broad sense / asterisk, and the insistence with which he contrasts the absolute validity of primary memory with the relative validity of secondary memory 5 clearly indicate both his intent and his uneasiness. His uneasiness stems from the fact that he is trying to retain two apparently irreconcilable possibilities. A. The living now is constituted as the absolute perceptual source only in a state of continuity with retention taken as non-perception. Fidelity to experience and to the things themselves forbids that it be otherwise. B. The source of certitude in general is the primordial character of the living now. It is necessary therefore to keep retention in the sphere of primordial certitude and to shift the frontier between the primordial and the non-primordial. The frontier must pass not between the pure present and the non-present, i.e., between the actuality and inactuality of a living now, but rather between two forms of the return or restitution of the present, retention and representation. Without reducing the abyss which may indeed separate retention from representation, without hiding the fact that the problem of their relationship is none other than that of the history of life and of life's becoming conscious, we should be able to say a priori that their common root, the possibility of repetition in its most general form, that is, the constitution of a trace in the most universal sense, is a possibility which not only must inhabit the pure actuality of the now but must constitute it through the very movement of difference it introduces. Such a trace is, if we can employ this language without immediately contradicting it or crossing it out as we proceed, more primordial than what is phenomenologically primordial. For the ideality of the form of presence itself implies that it be infinitely repeatable, that its return, as a return of the same, is necessary ad infinitum and is inscribed in presence itself. It implies that the return is the return of a present which will be retained in a finite movement or retention and that primordial truth, in the phenomenological sense of the term, is only to be found rooted in the finitude of this retention. It is furthermore implied that the relation with infinity can be instituted only in the opening of the form of presence upon ideality, as the possibility of a return ad infinitum. How can it be explained that the possibility of reflection and representation belongs by essence to every experience, without this non-self-identity of the presence called primordial? How could it be explained that this possibility belongs, like a pure and ideal freedom, to the essence of consciousness? Husserl ceaselessly emphasizes that it does, in speaking of reflection, especially in Ideas I6 and in speaking of representation, already in the phenomenology of internal time consciousness. 1 In all these directions, the presence of the present is thought of as arising from the bending back of a return, from the movement of repetition, and not the reverse. Does not the fact that this bending back is irreducible in presence or in self-presence, that this trace or difference is always older than presence and procures for it its openness, prevent us from speaking about a simple self-identity im selben Augenblick? Does this not compromise the usage Husserl wants to make of the concept of solitary mental life and consequently of the rigorous separation of indication from expression? Do indication and the several concepts on whose basis we have thus far tried to think it through, the concepts of existence, nature, mediation, the empirical, etc., not have an ineradicable origin in the movement of transcendental temporalization? By the same token, does not everything that is announced already in this reduction to solitary mental life, the transcendental reduction in all its stages, and notably the reduction to the monadic sphere of ownness, Eigenheit, etc., appear to be stricken in its very possibility by what we are calling time? But what we are calling time must be given a different name, for time has always designated a movement conceived in terms of the present, and can mean nothing else. Is not the concept of pure solitude, of the monad in the phenomenological sense, undermined by its own origin, by the very condition of its self-presence, that is, by time to be conceived anew on the basis now of difference within auto-affection, on the basis of identifying identity and non-identity within the sameness of the im selben Augenblick? Husserl himself evoked the analogy between the relation with the alter ego, constituted within the absolute monad of the ego, and the relation with the other present, the past present, as constituted in the absolute actuality of the living present. Cartesian Meditations, 52. Does not this dialectic, in every sense of the term and before any speculative subsumption of this concept, open up living to difference, and constitute, in the pure immanence of experience, the divergence involved in indicative communication and even in signification in general? And we mean the divergence of indicative communication and signification in general, for Husserl not only intends to exclude indication from solitary mental life, he will consider language in general, the element of logos, in its expressive form itself, as a secondary event, superadded to a primordial and pre-expressive stratum of sense. Expressive language itself would be something supervenient upon the absolute silence of self-relationship.